Chapter 4 Deeper. The queen stopped less than a meter from Emily. Up close, she was a wall of black chitin and slow, rippling muscle, the fine hairs on her legs brushing Emily's boots. Her eyes, clusters of smooth black orbs, reflected the dim light in tiny fractured images of Emily's face. The deep, throbbing pulse she gave off seemed to seep into Emily's chest, matching her heartbeat until she couldn't tell which was hers and which was the spider's. One of the smaller feeders scurried up the silk beside her head and pressed its fangs in her neck again. The burn came first, sharp and needling, followed by the warmth, creeping down her arms and legs, dulling the ache of the bindings. The air in the chamber seemed thicker, each breath slower, heavier. Her vision swam, time blurred. She was dimly aware of being left alone for stretches, only to feel the silk tremble when a feeder returned. Sometimes it bit her shoulder, sometimes her thigh, sometimes the crook of her arm. Always slow, always careful. The venom pulled her in and out of wakefulness. When she slipped under, the sounds of the chamber twisted, murmurs that might have been human voices whispering her name from inside the cocoons, laughter from somewhere in the darkness above, a sound like rain that she knew was the endless ripple of spider legs against silk. She dreamt of the Outback as a flat, endless sheet of web, stretching to the horizon, the sun caught and dimmed behind its strands. Every hill was a mound, every tree a stake holding down prey. When she woke, the dreams clung to her like the silk. Once, maybe hours later, maybe days, she turned her head enough to see the older man beside her. His eyes were open, staring into nothing, but his lips moved. She thought at first he was muttering nonsense, but when she strained to hear, the words came faint and slow. They keep you breathing, long as they can drink you every day. Emily's throat was too dry to speak. They like you to... No, the man wheezed. His gaze shifted, meeting hers for a heartbeat. Don't let him finish. Before she could answer, a feeder dropped onto his chest and bit into the soft skin of his neck. The man's eyes fluttered shut, and his head sagged forward. She began to notice a pattern. In the dim, reddish light, the swarm moved in waves. Clusters of feeders tending to certain victims at certain times, then leaving them for hours. The freshly caught prey were wrapped only halfway, their mouths and eyes uncovered. The older victims were sealed almost entirely, visited less often. And the ones cocooned completely, they were never touched again. The queen drank from only a handful each day. Those victims were always wrapped tighter afterward, their breathing shallow, their skin pale. Emily understood now. She and Darren weren't captives in the way a spider might snare a fly. They were stock, managed, kept alive in rotation. Sometimes she heard Darren. A muffled grunt, the scrape of silk as he shifted, a hissed curse. She tried to catch his eyes whenever she could, but their lines of sight were rarely aligned. The venom made it harder to keep her thoughts straight, but she clung to the knowledge that he was still moving. The chamber changed with the days. New prey arrived, dragged in by the swarm, screaming until the venom muted them. Old prey disappeared deeper into the mound, their cocoons carted away by dozens of legs. She never saw them return, and always the queen's pulse vibrated in the air, steady and certain, like the ticking of a clock. One night, though there was no sky here, only shifts in the dull glow from above, Emily's bindings were loosened. Not freed, but adjusted, the silk unspooling just enough to pull her a meter along the wall. They placed her beside someone new. It was a boy. Couldn't have been more than 15, his face blotched with tears and dirt. The silk covered him from the waist down, his arms bound tight against his sides. His eyes darted from her to the shadows above. They took Mum, he whispered. His voice cracked, as if speaking hurt. Dragged her further in. I can still hear her. Emily wanted to tell him not to listen, but before she could, a tremor ran through the web. The feeders descended again. One landed on the boy's chest. He screamed when the fangs sank in, but it was short, fading to a shuddering gasp as the venom hit. His eyes rolled back, and the spider drank slowly. Emily turned her face away, Her jaw clenched so tight it ached. The venom was starting to work differently on her now. Instead of blurring the edges of her fear, it sharpened them. She could feel her pulse against the silk, hear her breath hitching in the quiet moments. The hallucinations came more vividly. Shapes in the dark, a woman's voice telling her to stop fighting. It's easier this way. The tickle of legs she couldn't see. She realized it wasn't just the venom. They were breaking her down, not to kill her, to keep her. At some point, whether hours or days later, she saw Darren again. A cluster of feeders were tending to him, pulling silk tighter around his chest. He managed to catch her eyes and give the smallest nod. It was enough. Emily forced herself to focus. Through the haze, she began counting the feeders' visits, the queen's feeding cycles, the gaps between. She felt for weaknesses in the silk, for places where the strands didn't hold quite as tight. She knew she couldn't get out alone, but if she and Darren timed it, a tremor passed through the mound. Larger than before. Different. Every spider in the chamber froze. Even the feeders paused mid-bite. Then they began to move, not toward prey, but toward the far wall of the nest. Something was happening outside. For the first time since she'd been dragged in, the swarm's attention wasn't on her. Chapter 5, Through the Web. The tremor didn't stop. It rolled through the silk again, a low vibration that made every strand in the chamber quiver. The swarm poured toward the far wall, their legs a living waterfall of black, vanishing into a tunnel Emily hadn't seen before. Even the queen moved with urgency, her bulk gliding over the web floor. The chamber emptied by half. The feeders that remained twitched nervously, their legs shifting in place. They weren't feeding. They were listening. Emily took a slow, careful breath. This was the moment. She twisted her wrists against the silk. It was still tight, but without a feeder constantly reinforcing it, there was some give. She rolled her shoulders, straining until the fibers creaked faintly. Sweat slicked her skin, and every movement sent a pulse of pain through her bound muscles. Across the chamber, Darren was moving too, tiny, deliberate shifts that wouldn't draw attention. His face was taut, his jaw clenched. The boy beside Emily stirred. His eyes were wide, fixed on the emptying chamber. "They're scared," he whispered. Emily shook her head sharply. Quiet, but part of her agreed. The swarm's sudden movement wasn't hunger. It was reaction. Something outside had spooked them. One of the lingering feeders scuttled up the wall toward the tunnel, leaving Emily and the boy alone. She bent her wrists inward and felt one binding loosen just enough for her fingers to curl. The silk clung, stretching instead of snapping, but she kept working, winding it slowly over the edge of her thumb until it slipped free. Her right hand was out. She forced herself to pause. Listen. Make sure the sound of the web's movement hadn't drawn attention. Then she dug her fingers into the bindings across her chest, pulling them apart strand by strand. They stuck to her skin like glue, ripping away tiny hairs, but each breath she took came easier. She leaned sideways, working at the strands pinning her left arm. Across the chamber, Darren's right arm came loose. He didn't move yet, just waited, watching the remaining feeders. A long, high-pitched hiss echoed from deep within the tunnel. The sound made the air seem thinner. The feeders shivered and scurried after the others. They were alone. Emily pulled her legs free, her boots sinking slightly into the tacky floor. The boy was staring at her, lips trembling. "You're leaving me?" he whispered. Her stomach twisted. She'd seen what happened to those who stayed. She gripped the silk binding his arms and tore downward. The strands parted, sticky against her palms. "Stay quiet," she breathed. "And don't stop moving." The boy nodded, but his eyes kept darting upward. She crossed the chamber low and fast, keeping her hands spread for balance on the silk. Every step was slow. Pull too hard and the web would quiver. Darren met her halfway. His face was pale, his arms streaked with angry red welts from where the venom had been pumped in. "Which way?" he murmured. Emily glanced at the main tunnel where the swarm had gone. The sound of their legs echoed faintly down it. That way was suicide. She pointed to a smaller opening high up the chamber wall, a narrow, vertical slit lined with hanging cocoons. It might connect to another chamber, maybe even an exit, They climbed. The silk walls were springy, sagging under their weight, but each cocoon they passed acted as a kind of foothold. Emily tried not to look at the faces inside. Some were slack-jawed, still breathing. Others were hollowed, their skin drawn tight over bone. Halfway up, one of the cocoons shuddered violently. A muffled scream burst out, followed by frantic thrashing. Then something inside the silk bulged outward, a spider's leg punching through. The rest of the body followed in a tearing spray of silk and black ichor. The victim's scream cut short as the spider landed and scuttled down toward the chamber floor. Emily and Darren didn't move until it was gone. At the top, the slit widened into a low tunnel. It reeked of stale air and venom. The floor was layered with half-spun webs and discarded husks of prey. Birds, lizards, something that looked like a dingo pup. They crawled. The tunnel angled upward, each movement pulling sticky threads against their arms and faces. Twice Emily's hair caught and had to be ripped free, leaving strands tangled in the web. Darren moved ahead of her, pausing every few meters to listen. Somewhere behind them, the deep pulse of the queen returned, fainter now but steady. It wasn't aimed at them. Not yet. The tunnel opened into another chamber, smaller, but just as suffocating. The walls were lined with egg sacs, pale and swollen, some shifting faintly. The heat here was worse, heavy with the smell of damp silk. Darren muttered, "We can't go through here." But there was no other way. Emily forced herself forward, weaving between the sacs, her breath held. Each one brushed against her shoulders like clammy skin. Something inside and nearby, sac scraped faintly at the membrane. They reached the far side, just as a new tremor rippled through the web. This one closer, sharper. Darren froze. They know. Emily turned toward the narrow gap ahead. Then we move now. Chapter 6, Tight Squeeze. Emily shoved through the gap, the silk tearing in long, sticky ribbons that clung to her jacket. Darren followed close, his breathing ragged in the stale heat. The tunnel here sloped sharply upward, the air cooler, sharper. Light. It was faint, just a weak gray smear far ahead, but it was enough to make Emily's chest ache with desperate hope. Behind them, the tremor in the web sharpened into a chaotic vibration, dozens, no, hundreds, of legs hammering across silk. The swarm had split, coming from more than one tunnel. They weren't just chasing, they were hurting. "Move," Darren hissed, though his voice cracked into panic. They crawled faster, knees and palms tearing open on coarse rock where the silk had thinned. The faint light ahead flickered with movement, shadows shifting, blocking it, then revealing it again. Emily's gut tightened. Something was between them and the exit. They reached a wider space, low enough that they had to crouch, but high enough for sound to travel. It was filled with half-built web, strands sagging between jagged rocks. And perched in the middle, blocking the slope upward, was a feeder larger than the rest, its abdomen scarred, one leg torn away but healed over with hardened silk. Its multiple eyes reflected the pale light like wet stones. It didn't lunge right away, just flexed its fangs, waiting. The vibrations behind them grew louder. Emily's eyes darted to the rocks. There, a narrow gap on the left, half clogged with debris. "That way," she hissed. Darren rammed his shoulder into the gap, sending stones clattering into the dark beyond. Emily followed, scraping her ribs against the jagged edges as she squeezed through. The smell of dust and open air filled her nose, almost dizzying in contrast to the thick venom stench inside. The feeder shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, and scuttled after them. Its bulk hit the rocks, cracking one loose, but the gap was too tight for it to push through. They crawled uphill into a chute of crumbling red earth. Daylight spilled down from above, a narrow slit at the top, maybe 3 meters up. Emily clawed at the dirt, hauling herself upward. Every handful she gripped collapsed, sliding back toward Darren. He pushed her from below, his face streaked with dust and silk. Below, the hiss of the swarm filled the chute. The feeder's body blocked the gap for a moment, but smaller spiders swarmed over its back, spilling into the earth tunnel like water down a drain. Emily reached the slit and shoved one arm through. Sunlight burned her skin with a sudden, alien warmth. She kicked hard, Darren boosting her, until her chest cleared the opening and she tumbled onto the hard, baking surface. The sky was a blistering, cloudless white. The horizon wavered with heat. She turned, grabbing Darren's wrists and hauling him out just as the first spiders reached the top of the chute. They stopped at the sunlight's edge, twitching, their bodies recoiling from the open air. Emily's lungs heaved. The boy was still in the nest somewhere. Darren's voice was hoarse. "We can't go back." She didn't answer. She couldn't. Behind them, the swarm hissed in unison, the sound carrying out into the desert wind like a warning. The open outback stretched in every direction, heat, dust, and nowhere to hide. Chapter 6, Heat Like Teeth. The heat hit them like a physical blow. Emily squinted against the glare, her skin already prickling under the merciless sun. The red earth stretched forever, flat in some directions, broken in others by jagged rock spines that shimmered in the heat haze. No buildings, no road, no hint of water. Darren turned in a slow circle. "We're miles from where we came in." She scanned the horizon. Nothing moved, on the surface at least, but her boots picked up faint tremors underfoot, not strong enough to be obvious, but steady. The swarm hadn't stopped. They were moving beneath them, matching their pace. "They're following," she said. Darren cursed under his breath. "They won't cross into sunlight, but they don't have to. They'll just wait until we drop." They started walking toward a line of low cliffs in the distance, the closest thing resembling cover. The sun was high, the shadows short. Sweat slicked their backs within minutes, and every breath was like pulling air through sandpaper. Emily kept her eyes on the ground, looking for cracks, holes, anything that might connect to the nest below. The swarm could surface anywhere. She'd seen the way they moved through the tunnels, how fast they could be when the silk didn't slow them. If they found a shaded vent, they'd come pouring out. The tremors grew stronger. An hour in, Darren stopped suddenly, crouching beside a patch of disturbed soil. The fine dust there sagged inward in a perfect circle. He dropped a stone into it. There was a faint hiss. Then the stone vanished into the shifting dirt as if the ground had swallowed it. Emily's stomach nodded. "That's a sinkhole. Or a trap," Darren muttered. The hiss from below intensified for a moment, then faded again. Something had been waiting right under the surface. They moved on, giving the patch a wide berth. By the time they reached the cliffs, the sun had shifted lower, the light growing hotter, redder. The cliff face was a wall of fractured sandstone, pocked with dark crevices. Darren touched the rock and swore. It was almost too hot to bear. "Caves mean shade," Emily said. "Caves mean entrances," he countered, nodding at the holes in the cliff face. She knew he was right. The swarm could use these to surface. But they had no choice. Out here in the open, they'd collapse before sundown. The tremors under their feet were becoming erratic now, sometimes darting ahead of them before circling back, like wolves pacing prey. They found a narrow overhang at the cliff's base, just enough shade to crouch in without baking alive. Emily dug her nails into the red dirt, her hands trembling, not from fear, but from exhaustion. The heat had stripped her strength faster than she'd thought possible. The boy's face flashed in her mind, pale in the nest's darkness. She shoved the image away, but it clung like cobwebs. Darren leaned against the rock, eyes half closed. "We need water. We keep moving after sundown." The ground vibrated faintly beneath them. Emily's gaze drifted toward one of the larger crevices, black as a pupil. She thought she saw something shift inside, something low and many-legged. The sun still had an hour before it touched the horizon. Chapter 7, After the Sun Drops. The sun bled into the horizon, turning the cliffs the color of old rust. Shadows stretched long and cool over the red dirt, and with them came the first sound, an almost delicate skittering, far off but closing fast. Emily's stomach went cold. "They're coming up." Darren was already grabbing the pack, slinging it over his shoulder. "We move now. Stay close to the rock wall. If they try to flank us, we need something at our back." They slipped from the overhang into the cooling air. Every step away from the fading sunlight felt wrong, but the shadows moved faster than they did, swallowing the desert whole. The first one surfaced 20 meters ahead. It came up silent, breaking through the sand like a fish breaching water, the fine dust cascading off its legs. Its body was the size of a cattle dog, black and glossy, eyes like glass beads catching the last scraps of light. Emily didn't wait. She swung the pry bar from her belt, smashing down. The spider jerked once, legs curling, then went still. But the ground around it was already moving, rippling with tiny, shifting bulges. "Run!" Darren shouted. They sprinted along the base of the cliffs, the sand soft and treacherous underfoot. Every few meters another spider would break the surface, forcing them to veer closer to the wall. The tremors were all around now, moving faster than their steps, cutting them off before they could react. Then the cliff split into a narrow chasm, maybe a meter wide, the floor vanishing into shadow. Without thinking, Darren darted inside. Emily followed, the space so tight their shoulders brushed both walls. The air inside was cool still, too still. The skittering came again, but not from behind. This time, it echoed ahead, deeper in the chasm. Darren slowed, holding up a hand, listening. Something large was moving in there, something dragging itself slowly along the stone. Emily's voice was barely a whisper. "We can't go back." The sound behind them confirmed it. More legs, clicking on rock now instead of sand. They pushed forward, the chasm twisting like a serpent. The moonlight faded as the walls leaned inward, and soon they were in complete dark, moving by feel.